Hi everybody, welcome back to the third in our series of talks on sexuality. We're investigating human sexuality. In this talk, thinking about researching human sexuality, easier said than done, and the very interesting findings that it reveals. And I'm going to tell you about a very interesting person, Alfred Kinsey, very much the first sex researcher. Good, what can we say about Kinsey and his life and his work? He was originally not a sex researcher, but a biologist, not interested in human sexuality, but rather the worms and the insects and all the things that they do. And apparently, the story goes, he had his interest in human sexuality through the questions from his students. His students from time to time would ask him about human sexual practices, rather than animal or insect or worm. And he became aware of the limitations of scientific knowledge in this area. He would often be forced to say, we don't really know. So he chose to change this. He chose to undertake research to find out what human sexual practices really were common. Good, so let's think about researching human sexual practices. Consider with your partner the difficulties researchers have in finding out people's true sexual practices. Why is it hard to ask people about their sexuality and learn about what they feel and what they really do? Pause here, natter with your partner. What have you come up with? There's a whole bunch of difficulties here. I guess the most obvious point is that human beings don't normally like talking about their sexuality. This is not something that most of us would normally talk about in our lives. This is private stuff, information about ourselves. Some of it may even be secret, and we wouldn't normally share this information. So Kinsey was well aware that was his main challenge, finding truthful information. He had a secondary problem. He also wanted to find out about what sexuality was like in our populations, in the sense of the typical person. Okay, so he was really looking at getting some statistics, getting some numbers, getting some percentages, and that's obviously going to be difficult to do. An obvious challenge he had, for example, was to find representative chunks of society rather than just asking particular people about their sexuality. Those people who are keen to talk about their sexuality presumably are highly untypical of the population, and their sexualities in numbers may be untypical of the population as a whole. So big problems getting representative findings because of the sensitivity of the topic. Good. My next question for you to natter in pairs about, what solutions would you suggest to help the sex researcher overcome some of the practical hurdles you mentioned? What must researchers do to collect reliable and true data on our sexuality? Once again, natter with your partner. I don't know what you came up with, but let me tell you how Kinsey did it. This is Kinsey's approach to collecting data. He proceeded as follows. Firstly, face-to-face interviews, not written questionnaires. Kinsey's interviewees did not get a printed written questionnaire in the post, which they filled in and returned in the stamped addressed envelope. That's not what he did. Why not? Pause here and discuss with your partner. I guess the answer here is this question of getting truthful answers. If you ask me about something and I think that my feelings, my thoughts, my preferences, my practices, if I think that those are maybe unusual or morally wrong, or maybe even in practice illegal, I'm going to be careful as to what answer I give you. I might lie because I feel that my truthful answer is the wrong answer. That's the danger here. Now, if I get the survey on paper, my temptation to lie might be quite great because it's so easy for me to write down something which isn't true. Face-to-face, it's a different ball game, isn't it? Ultimately, the interviewer can look at the interviewee in the eyes, and the interviewer may even have a feeling, a kind of intuitive sense for when an answer is being untruthful. So the potential for getting to the truth, for Kinsey, it was obvious, you have to have face-to-face interviews. It's more work, it's more time, but you have to do it. Interesting, huh? The interviewer is very carefully trained to give non-judgmental responses to the disclosure of sexual practices. By its nature, by the nature of the topic, the interviewer is going to be getting surprising answers. They're going to be hearing new things all the time, new and very private and very secretive things. So the interviewer has to be sensitive, the interviewer has to be trained to not react in some kind of shocked way. Okay, so a bit of training, and it's easier said than done, I know. Okay, good. Next, really important point, the answers given are treated completely confidentiality. These secrets will stay secrets. Yes, the answers will contribute to findings which will be published, but they'll all be anonymized. So when the information was recorded by the interviewer, they would not write down full words and sentences, but rather the interviewer would code the answers. Okay, so if I'm the interviewee and I'm talking about some aspect of my sexuality, which back in 1948 was illegal, I don't have to worry. This is not going to be recorded in such a way that it can incriminate me. So this is a fascinating point. Goes without saying, there's all kinds of ethical questions around this research, but for Kinsey to get truthful findings about the real behaviours of our populations, he had to be able to promise this anonymity. Am I saying it right? Anonymity? I think I am. He had to be able to promise that it would be treated as anonymous and confidential. The code that was written down, the code that was used when writing down the answers was itself never written down. So these coded sheets could only be decoded by the researchers, the original interviewers themselves. Isn't that fascinating? So you can tell that Kinsey had really worked on developing a research technique to deal with many of the challenges of this research in question. Good. In terms of the population question that I touched upon a few moments ago, he wanted to have representative answers rather than just having a bunch of people that liked talking about sex. He would also try to get whole cohorts. So if he was interviewing students, he'd try to get the whole year, for example, or the whole class. He had various tricks to try and find representative findings. It's quite interesting. Nonetheless, some of his findings are still contested to this day, and if you're interested, after I give you some of his findings, you can check, and there's a whole bunch of websites giving you tips to scientists, scholars that have tested Kinsey's original numbers, and there's fascinating discussions there as well. Good. Maybe it's nice for me to give you a different insight into Kinsey's life. There was a wonderful film, a biopic made something like 15 years ago, starring Liam Neeson as Kinsey. So a film based on Kinsey's life, and it deals a lot with his work. We're going to watch a specially edited series of scenes, not the whole film, but just something like 10 or 12 minutes, giving the background to Kinsey's interest, touching on interview methods, revealing respondents' answers to the questions, many of which are really quite surprising. Some will make you smile. And the clip also hints at the public sensitivity of the findings. So this is quite literally hot research. Have a look at that clip and natter with your neighbour, with your partner about it. Good. Kinsey really changed the way we look at human sexuality. His own findings led him to real insights as to how we are. And the point I'm going to mention now is one of the most interesting ones. Kinsey, he was himself keen to question the conventional wisdom, try to get to the real facts, not just what other people think. One particularly interesting question was the question of sexuality in the sense of homosexuality and heterosexuality. Now, up until this time, people categorized people either or. The idea in society was either you were homosexual or you were heterosexual. So we thought we had two separate populations. Kinsey spoke famously about this. He argues males do not represent two discrete populations, heterosexual and homosexual. The world is not to be divided into sheep and goats. The living world is a continuum in each and every one of its aspects. So his biologist's instincts here are suggesting we shouldn't think of homosexuality and heterosexuality as being an either-or thing. That's wrong. See it as a continuum. See it as a spectrum. see it as being something like a scale. And he created a scale to actually measure this. He had a 7-point scale. And today we still use this and we call it the Kinsey scale. It goes from 0 to 6. Okay, now if I'm on the 0 end of a scale, I consider myself to be entirely heterosexual. And if I'm only attracted to the same sex, if I'm entirely homosexual, I'm a 6. And many people are going to be somewhere in between. So many people may have aspects of bisexuality. And if I was equally attracted to men and women, I'd be a 3. Is this scale making sense? You can get your head around it. So I think about it and I place myself somewhere on this scale. Okay, so that's how Kinsey was looking at this question of heterosexuality, homosexuality, or different degrees of bisexuality. Good. Kinsey's studies, his publications, his work was published very quickly actually in the 1940s and the 1950s, commonly known as the Kinsey reports. So if you enter that into a search engine, you'll find sites describing the Kinsey reports. There were 2. Sexual Behaviour in the Human Male, published as a book in 1948. 5 years later, Sexual Behaviour in the Human Female. Kinsey gave public lectures. He was talking, for example, at universities. What do you think? Natter with your partner. Do you think his work interested the public? Did his work interest the public? Have a natter think about that. What did you guess? What did you guess? His work was very, very interesting for the general public. His books sold very, very well. His public lectures, he would fill university auditoriums. You know, they couldn't pack any more people into these rooms. This was information, this was research findings which utterly interested the public. In a sense, I guess we could have expected that, couldn't we? In part, his findings really were utterly fascinating. Some of them may be unsurprising today, and I'm talking now in 2020, but at the time, he really was providing us with new insights into what people think, feel, and do. Look at this. Findings: 69% of men, more than 2/3, had visited a prostitute at least once in their life so far. 50% of all married males had some extramarital experience or some kind of affair, at least at some point during their married lives. 46% of males had reacted to persons of both sexes, of which 37% had at least one homosexual experience. 10% of males were more or less exclusively homosexual. Interesting numbers, hey? My next question for you to discuss with your partner: did any of these statistics surprise you? Do you believe the numbers? And how do you think sexual practices have changed since the 1940s? Again, this is research findings from the 1940s. Would it be different today? Have a discussion, pause here. I mean, there's a lot that we can talk about here, isn't there? The statistics really surprised people at that time. There was obviously a rush to check these statistics. Many of the numbers, for example, these statistics here were higher than people had previously thought. In particular, the last bullet point here, where I collect those particular statistics together, 46% people had reacted to persons of both sexes. You know, he's suggesting that something like half the population, in this case half the male population, have some aspect of bisexuality. And again, 37% with one homosexual experience. More than 1/3 of men had had a homosexual experience. 10% of males more or less exclusively homosexual. You may be skeptical. Interestingly, exactly these statistics have been confirmed. The consensus is, although it's very, very hard to pin down the exact numbers, there'll always be argument over a few percent, those figures we think today are still as close to the mark as we can get. Some argue that levels of homosexuality are slightly increased in Kinsey's findings, but even if they're slightly overestimated, the real number is going to be somewhere not so far away. So that's fascinating, and Kinsey really was the first person to give us these numerical insights. My last question: how do you think sexual practices have changed since the 1940s? One of my students noted, you know, we have different practical opportunities, we have different technological opportunities that presumably will impact on some of these numbers. For example, the first one, men visiting prostitutes, presumably men would have other opportunities due to sexuality in society today. They wouldn't necessarily have to go to a prostitute, as people would have done back in the 1940s, hoping to get premarital sex. So because of social change, some of these numbers may very, very slightly change, simply because of the opportunities that people have. But very, very interesting numbers. And again, you'll find more if you check out these books. Yeah, let's come to a close now. I showed you that film clip from the Kinsey film. It goes without saying, if you want to watch more related to that, the whole film is well worth checking out. Let's come to a close for now. Thanks for viewing.